Jeff's a dear friend and also a distinguished professor up at Carlisle at the U.S. Army War College, but his connections go wide and far to many different pieces that he touches: national security, both within the government and without. A multi-talented individual who I've learned a lot from. So, Jeff, I'm going to turn it to you to introduce your panel.
Well, Art, thank you very much for those very, very kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure for me to be back here at the Naval Academy with many old friends. I treasure, one of the things that I do is I am a senior fellow at the Stockdale Center of Ethical Leadership here at the Naval Academy, though sadly I don't get as many opportunities to come down here as I would like. As Art said, I currently hold a position at the Army War College, and also the first gentleman I'm going to introduce, I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York. But let me just go ahead and because you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to the panel. And let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker for this very distinguished panel on the questions of preventive and preemptive war, and that is, of course, David Rodin. David Rodin is Senior Fellow at the University of Oxford, where he co-directs the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, and is a Senior Fellow as well, as head for the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York. He's obviously totally qualified to be a member of this panel based on his publications, which include Preemption, Just and Unjust Warriors, and War and Self-Defense. He is also, of course, a graduate of Oxford University, a Rhodes Scholar from New Zealand, and spent time as a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian National University. In addition to his duties at Oxford University, David also obviously has a direct impact on policy, how we translate these amazing ideas into policy, as he's busy teaching in his regular lecture at the United Kingdom's Joint Service and Command and Staff College, where he provides ethical training for senior military officers up to the rank of Major General. So with that in mind, David, I will turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. Is that on? Can you hear me? Well, it's a real pleasure to be here in this very distinguished and august gathering, including with so many really good friends and colleagues. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of preventive military action. And like Jean's remarks, I'm going to draw a distinction between preemption, which I'm understanding as military action against a threat that is imminent, as, for example, in Israel 1967. So preemption on the one hand, and preventive action, which is action against a threat that is not imminent, which is distant or not yet fully formed. And like Jean, we can think about that with reference to George Bush's 2002 national security strategy, which said that there was a right or readiness to fight preventive action against, and I quote here, emerging threats before they're fully formed. Now, I want to suggest that there are very, very strong moral reasons for not endorsing a doctrine that would allow preventive action, action against a threat that is not imminent but that is emerging in that way. But unlike Jean's remarks, I'm not going to focus on the status of rights and the status of the rights of states, and in particular ideas of state sovereignty. What I want to look at is the effects of preventive war on individual persons. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can understand that. So one of the ways that people have historically often thought about preventive action is in terms of consequences, of a kind of utilitarian analysis. So on the one hand, you balance the idea that preventive action might be very efficient in welfare terms. You might be able to stop a threat before it becomes so big that you'd have to have a tremendously destructive war in order to stop it. But balanced against that, of course, are a whole series of so-called rule utilitarian or rule consequentialist reasons. So people have thought, well, if we had a rule, like you find in the national security strategy, allowing preventive action, that might be a charter for destabilization in many areas of the world where you have states that kind of have reasonable fears of each other. You think about India, Pakistan, North and South Korea. A number of people have commented that under the Bush doctrine, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor probably would have been a permissible act of preventive action. So there are a whole series of issues around that, but that's not the series of issues that I really want to talk about either. What I want to talk about is what are the requirements for being liable to have force used against you. So the background assumption that I'm starting with is that ordinary human beings have rights against being attacked and killed. And it can only be permissible to attack and kill them if they have themselves done something to make them liable to be treated in that way. You don't lose that right simply because it is useful or important in order to attack you in that way. You can only lose these rights against being attacked by doing something that makes you liable to be attacked in that way. So I'm taking it as a starting point that a military action, a war, can only be justifiable if the people that you are attacking, that you're directing force against, have done something to make themselves liable in that way. And the problem, of course, arises because in ordinary contexts of thinking about, for example, liability in self-defense, you become liable when you have engaged in a wrongful attack or wrongful act of aggression against someone else. You don't normally become liable to attack because you will engage in a wrongful aggression at some point in the future. So let me give you a kind of rather contrived philosophical case that's meant to kind of get us to reflect on this idea. So imagine that I was observing a friend or a colleague of mine reading through some of his personal letters. I'm observing him through a long-range telescope. And I can see that he's reading through these letters, and in that pile of letters, I know there's a letter from me proving that I've been unfaithful with his wife, right? And I know this guy, right? I know that if once he reads that letter, he will get inevitably, he will form and then act upon a murderous intention to kill me. Right. So I know as soon as he reads these papers, he's going to want to kill me, and he will in fact take steps to wrongfully kill me. Now let's say that I have a high-powered rifle, and I could take him out prior to his reading those letters. Now presumably we have a very, very strong intuition that even if we accept that we can know with 99% accuracy that he will in fact engage in a wrongful attack against me as soon as he reads that letter, we can't do that until he has actually done something. He's crossed a certain threshold of wrongful action. There was a movie a couple of years back, Minority Report, with Tom Cruise. Very, very similar idea, right? You imagine that we can know infallibly in the future that somebody will commit a crime. Still, there's a very strong sense in which you don't become liable to punishment or defensive violence until you have crossed a threshold of actually doing something wrongful in order to assume that kind of liability. So here, of course, is the problem with preventive military action. Right? In preventive military action, we're using force against people who we believe will undertake a wrongful act of aggression at some time in the future, but haven't yet done that. So they seem analogous to the person reading the letters or the people who will commit crimes in Minority Report. Now, of course, there is a response to that argument or those set of thoughts, and that is to say, well, look, engaging in an act of aggression is not the only kind of wrongful action that could potentially make you liable to defensive force. We also have the idea of engaging in a wrongful conspiracy to undertake aggressive or criminal action. We have this concept very strongly worked out within criminal law, for example. And as with so many things in the ethics of war, we find this idea most beautifully and eloquently formulated by Michael Walzer. So I'll read out the way that Michael Walzer has of thinking about this. Right? He's extremely helpful. So what Michael says is the line between legitimate and illegitimate first strike is not going to be drawn at the point of imminent attack, but at the point of sufficient threat. And interestingly, that language of sufficient threat is used in the Bush national security strategy, whether consciously or unconsciously, I don't know. It might just be a consequence of the way that Michael's ways of thinking and writing have permeated all of our ways of thinking. But he says the line won't be drawn at the point of imminent attack, but at the point of sufficient threat. That phrase, he says, is necessarily vague. I mean it to cover three things: a manifest intent to injure, a degree of active preparation that makes that intent a positive danger, and a general situation in which waiting or doing anything other than fighting greatly magnifies the risk. Right? So here we have a conception which says, well, you can become liable to attack, not only when you are imminently about to engage in an act of aggression, but when you have undertaken this kind of active preparation, this conspiratorial preparation for attack. Now that seems like a pretty plausible way of solving this conundrum, but I want to suggest that it has a very, very paradoxical conclusion or implication. Because the problem is that, as we all know, soldiers don't just undertake actions. They always plan for those actions, right? So any military organization will undertake planning and will specifically develop doctrines of action. So if a military, like the United States military, is going to undertake preemptive or preventive action, then it will generate doctrine in order to allow them to do that. At the highest level, the national security strategy can be seen as exactly that kind of doctrine. Now, what I want to suggest is that this idea that engaging in a conspiracy to attack is a sufficient condition for being liable to preventive action generates the following paradox. And I'm going to read this out because it's a little bit complicated. Right? So I think everything here hinges on whether engaging in a conspiracy to attack is itself a wrongful act that is sufficient to ground rights of preventive action. So remember that as Michael construes it, this has at least two elements. There has to be a manifest intent to injure, first, and secondly, there has to be a level of active preparation. But, and here's the problem, these two elements precisely describe any articulated doctrine of prevention, such as, for example, you find in the 2002 National Security Strategy. So that doctrine quite explicitly affirms both the intention to attack, so it says the United States will, if necessary, act preemptively, and it also articulates active preparations for doing so. It says to support preemptive options, we will build better, more integrated intelligence capabilities, coordinate closely with allies, transform our military forces. So, if a conspiracy to attack consisting in manifest intent and active preparation is a form of wrongdoing sufficient to ground preventive military action, then it looks like doctrines of prevention, such as we find in the National Security Strategy, are ipso facto morally wrong. So the paradox, I think, here, we can see it emerging quite clearly. If manifest intent and active preparation together constitute a wrong that's sufficient to ground preventive military action, then any doctrine of preventive war looks like it's going to be impermissible. If, on the other hand, doctrines of prevention are permissible, then the combination of manifest intent and active preparation are presumably not in themselves wrong, and that seems to imply that there is no sufficient moral ground for engaging in preventive action. So the paradox looks similar in structure to the famous liar's paradox, which consists in a statement that is true if it is false and false if it is true. On the conspiracy account, if preventive wars are permissible, then doctrines of preventive war, such as the National Security Strategy, are impermissible. If doctrines of preventive war are permissible, then preventive wars themselves are impermissible. So I think this is a really, really tricky paradox that really undermines this idea that not only an active threat of aggression, but a conspiracy to engage in future aggression can be a sufficient cause for preventive action. Now, just very briefly, I've probably got a few minutes left. Let me just indicate kind of one further twist on this argument. Because one thing you might say about the argument is, well, it's all kind of very nice and very clever, but what it misses out is that there are important differences in the way that organizations can plan for future military action, can undertake what I described as a conspiracy for future action. And in particular, you need to distinguish between a contingent and a non-contingent form of military planning. So the thought might be this. Conspiracy to undertake future military action, consisting in manifest intent and active preparation, is only morally objectionable if it's non-contingent in its form. In other words, but it can be entirely acceptable when it has a contingent form, right? So in other words, when we say, well, we're planning to attack them preemptively, but only because they were planning to attack us, right? So you draw a distinction between contingent forms of conspiracy to attack and non-contingent forms. And so then you might say, well, contingent forms, like the National Security Strategy, are fine. They don't generate liability to attack because we only have a contingent preparation to attack, which is based on the fact that they are planning to attack us in a non-contingent way. Well, I think that is a meaningful distinction. There clearly is distinction to be made between those two different ways of thinking about planning for attack. But I think the problem here is that it's very, very difficult to see how a rule based on that distinction could be operable in international relations. We know that modern states have standing armies. Those armies constantly engage in planning activities for military action, both for defensive and offensive military action. So the kind of preparation side of it, I think, has to be taken as read. Everything will then turn on these very, very fine-tuned assessments of what the intentionality of the partner is, right? Were they planning to attack us only because we expressed our doctrine of preemptive action, because they heard this axis of evil attention? So is their intention to attack us conditional in that sense, or is it unconditional? Were they planning to attack us irrespective of our intentions and our doctrines of preemption? It seems to me that a rule that was based on that kind of incredibly fine-tuned assessment of the intentionality of partners is one that could very, very rarely be operable in international relations. In addition, I think there's going to be a very significant question about whether the liability that it's assumed by that kind of wrongful, unconditional intention, whether that will actually apply to the people that we will have to, at the end of the day, attack and kill in a military action. Because, you can imagine two cases, right? You can imagine a case where the intention to plan a criminal conspiracy to attack is spread right throughout the armed forces, right? So it's not only the very senior leadership, but all of the soldiers as well who are engaged in planning and preparation to engage in an attack at some point in the future. Well, if that's the case, that looks very much like a case of an imminent threat, right? If all of the soldiers and the whole military apparatus are engaged in this planning activity, that looks very much like a case of imminent attack, in which case it wouldn't be an act of prevention at all. It would be much more like a 1967 style case of preemption. Much more likely is going to be a case where this planning, this non-conditional conspiracy, as I called it, is actually limited to the very, very high echelons of leadership, right? It's going to be taking place at the level of the political elite, perhaps the very, very senior members of the armed forces. The ordinary soldiers, presumably, are going to be doing what they always do. They're going to be engaging in their normal, legitimate barracks activities. Now, if that's the case, it's very hard to understand how those soldiers can be liable to be attacked and killed. If there is a conspiracy, but it's occurring at the level of the leadership, not at the level of those soldiers, if those soldiers are doing nothing more than they would normally be entitled to do in barracks activities, how can we explain that they have done something that makes them liable to action, to military action? So I think that when we think about it in this context, we can see that there really is a very, very profound issue with preventive action. And I just want to point out one way in which this connects quite nicely, I think, with Jean's remarks. Jean said that the way that she was thinking about preventive action is it might be analogous to the way that Michael Walzer thinks about supreme emergency. Now, if I'm right in saying that the main problem with preventive military action is that it kills people who are not liable to be killed because they haven't yet done anything wrongful to make themselves liable, that would explain, I think, Jean's intuition. Because those people, those soldiers who haven't done anything on my account to make themselves liable to be killed, are very much like the civilians, the non-combatants that Michael Walzer is worried about in his account of supreme emergency. Now, I think probably Jean and I probably part company in that I'm much more skeptical of the idea that there is a permission to attack non-combatants in cases of supreme emergency. But if what I've said here is right, that would at least explain why Jean might be right to say that we should think about cases of supreme emergency and cases of preventive war in a very similar way. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Very good indeed. Thank you, David. Our next speaker this morning is Steve Ward. Steve is currently the CIA visiting professor here at the United States Naval Academy, working in the Leadership, Ethics, and Law Department in the Stockdale Center. Steve has spent 25 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, serving in a variety of assignments in analytics, managerial, and policy positions. His work has focused primarily on the Middle East, and his assignments have included as Director for Intelligence Programs at the National Security Council, as well as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Near East Affairs on the National Intelligence Council. Steve is the author of Immortal, A Military History of Iran and its Armed Forces, and has published as well broadly, particularly on the Middle East. Now, the most important thing you need to know about Steve, though, Steve is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, a graduate of the United States Military Academy here at West Point, as am I, proving once again how hospitable the United States Naval Academy is in their desire to maintain a high level of discourse. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As you may have gathered from Colonel McCausland's very kind introduction, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not an ethicist, I'm definitely not a lawyer, but as he indicated, I'm an intelligence officer and specifically an intelligence analyst. That's one of the reasons why I'm really a little bit daunted this morning daunted at the prospect of speaking to you all and being part of this distinguished panel and conference. But I was asked to be here. I was asked to come after a series of conversations over in Luce Hall at the Stockdale Center about my experiences as one of the senior military analysts working on Iraq in the run-up to the invasion of that country in 2002 and 2003. And those conversations struck some people as interesting, and so what I'm going to be talking about in my short time here is sort of the perspective if you would, from the working level of someone trying to support the national security policies of the United States about preventive war, or war in general, using Iraq as an example. And actually, it might be more correct to say that I was asked to talk about the reasons the CIA was not called explicitly to consider just war criteria during the pre-invasion period. Let me emphasize that my experience represents at best a keyhole view of the events of that time. I don't really know more than what I experienced firsthand, and I do not presume to know all the considerations that senior policymakers and senior officials at my own agency used in their deliberations. Nonetheless, I present my views to you in the hope that some will find them useful, if not interesting. Before I go further, I also must say, as a serving CIA officer, that these are my views alone. They do not represent the official positions of the CIA or any other U.S. government agency. In addition, although my remarks have been reviewed by the CIA, nothing I say should be construed to represent U.S. government authentication or agency endorsement of my views. So now that I got that disclaimer out of the way, I can begin. To start, I was actually a little bit surprised in our discussions in Luce Hall that there was interest in what I was saying about CIA and the lack of any official consideration there about the wisdom or morality of going to war. Part of the reason for my surprise was that having lived it and avidly read many of the post-war memoirs and histories, I thought these issues were well understood, or at least well discussed. In particular, I thought it was common knowledge that the decision to go to war with Iraq apparently never received a fraction of the attention given by policymakers to the issues of how to go to war or how to explain the use of military force to the American people. But on reflection, I recognize that in the context of the time, which made such an approach understandable to CIA officers and others working on Iraq, it may not have been as clear to other people who weren't deeply involved in the process. Also, it occurred to me that most people outside the intelligence community may not know how we view the roles of strategic intelligence, ethics, and the values of analytic objectivity and integrity. Ethics, by the way, is not foreign to CIA. It's part and parcel of operational decisions that are made every day at Langley. This is especially true when it comes to covert action, the one CIA mission that makes us unique within the intelligence community, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. So the two main points I'd like to talk about in my remarks today. First, and this is nothing remarkable, is the idea that context matters. And it especially matters when discussing the practical application of ethics to national security policy. Without doubt, discussions about the moral obligations and legal standards of what Michael Walzer calls the wars of anticipation are valuable. But as Richard Betts of Columbia University has written, quote, "If one is interested in influencing the practice of governments in choosing preventive or preemptive attack as a policy, the key is to analyze the strategic wisdom or error of these military options rather than competing assertions about their legality." And I think when you talk about legality, you can also, as was discussed earlier, talk about the relationship between morality and legality. Second, a primary role of intelligence is to help policymakers deal with uncertainty. But even the best and most accurate intelligence assessments are no substitute for moral reasoning. Secret information and analysis can help answer the questions that flow from just war criteria and from international law. Ultimately, however, it's the policymakers and military commanders that hold the greatest responsibility for how they use the information and judgments. On my first point, I think CIA and the intelligence community analysts were appropriately focused, as Beth suggests, on matters that help policymakers and warfighters determine how best to conduct the war. I will discuss later why this is an appropriate, if not the complete, role of intelligence. But I think it is important to note that part of the reason for the disregard of the should aspect at that time is that by early 2002, it seemed to many of us at the CIA and elsewhere that that question had already been answered. I mentioned that I'm not a philosopher or lawyer, but as a former military officer and military analyst at CIA, I was familiar with just war theory and the concepts of preventive and preemptive war. During the current academic year, I have the privilege of teaching ethics and moral reasoning to the third classmen here at the Naval Academy and have been reintroduced in more depth to these concepts in preparation for instructing my students. And despite this background, and this was discussed earlier this morning as well, I'm not sure I'm clear even now about how to think morally about the decision to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom. Because at the time, for many of us who had been involved with Iraq for years, it didn't seem so much that we were going to war, as someone else pointed out earlier, is that we were preparing to end an ongoing war. And I don't know the answer is if it's preemptive or preventive to start what might be called the final campaign of existing hostilities. As many of you probably know from firsthand experience, the U.S. military and CIA had been at war with Iraq since 1990. I recently found a BBC chronology of the U.S.-Iraqi conflict between 1990 and 2002 that included the incidents in the no-fly zones, the sanction enforcement measures, Iraqi military actions against the Kurds, 1998's Operation Desert Fox, and many other episodes. It was 12 pages long. In addition, as most of you are aware, regime change was the official U.S. policy through the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998. From our perspective at the agency, or at least those of us working in Iraq, it seemed that the United States had been besieging Iraq for years. And while the cost to the U.S. was relatively low, I don't think no person with morals could be unsympathetic to the human cost to Iraq of this conflict. Unfortunately, as Joy Gordon of Fairfield University has recorded, the Iraq policies of 3 U.S. administrations and American bureaucratic practices resulted in what she called a type of indifference that contributed to the most severe sanctions ever imposed in the name of international governance, and that played a role in the humanitarian catastrophe that occurred in Iraq. As analysts, we understood the dilemmas faced by our policymakers in trying to press Iraq while protecting Iraqis against Saddam's ultimate culpability for their situation. But there was no denying that Iraqi civilians were suffering terribly because of the sanctions-based effort to stop Saddam and to keep him from rebuilding his military power. I don't think any group of people were more upset than the Iraq watchers of the intelligence community when then U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, made what she later admitted was a foolish comment about Iraq in a 1996 interview with the news show 60 Minutes. You may recall that in response to a question about the toll of sanctions on Iraq, she said that it was worth the lives of 500,000 Iraqi children to contain Saddam. Now, I don't know that 500,000 number has ever been authoritatively verified as the cost, but even as a hypothetical, and as she admitted, that's a question that needs a lot of thought, or an answer that needs a lot of thought by policymakers and those of us in the intelligence community. Clearly, by the 2000s, something had to give. I recall that there was a sense at CIA as early as the start of the George W. Bush administration that this siege must come to an end. Existing sanctions were unraveling, and the prospects for the new smart sanctions seemed dim. Situation put me in mind of John Wayne's line from the original True Grit. You can't serve papers on a rat, baby sister. You either kill him or let him be. And I don't think anyone at the time thought that the administration was inclined to let Saddam be. The sense of the need for a military solution only intensified after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Almost immediately, there were expressed concerns over the potential that Saddam would opportunistically create problems for the United States to advance his interests amid the war on terror. I suppose it's one of the great ironies of the time that to the extent OIF was intended to prevent Saddam from distracting us from the fight against terrorists, the invasion of Iraq eventually led us to becoming enmeshed in what many would argue is the major diversion from our principal conflict. I don't think it was ever clear to anyone at CIA when the decision to go to war occurred. I have to agree with George Tenet's comments in his memoir. Those of us supporting the U.S. military, such as myself, had a sense fairly early as we saw CENTCOM's war plan develop that war was likely inevitable. Analysts following Saddam's weapons program or his alleged links to al-Qaeda appear to have come to this conclusion much later. As I mentioned earlier, most of us shared the impression that the issue of should we go to war had already been decided by the summer of 2002, and thus it seemed natural to focus on how. In the trenches then, most generally assumed the war was going to occur barring some unlikely set of circumstances resulting in Saddam's demise or the Iraqis' capitulation. There were differing opinions, of course, about the wisdom of this, but as professionals we continue to do our work. Also, and this was touched upon earlier, it was easy enough to rationalize the prospect of war as an effort to enforce international law because of Iraq's violations of UN Security Council resolutions and the 1991 ceasefire agreement. In addition, because of the concern I mentioned earlier about the cost of our sanctions policy to the Iraqi people, viewing future military operations in part as a needed humanitarian intervention only seemed natural. In fact, many of my fellow Iraqi analysts had spent years supporting the U.S. government as its efforts to indict Iraqi officials for the various crimes against humanity and in tracking and documenting the terror and even the ecological devastation that Saddam inflicted on his country. In my opinion, these views and subsequent public statements by U.S. officials in support of applying the Bush Doctrine to Iraq intended to conflate the issue of humanitarian intervention and preventive and preemptive war. It did not make for a particularly clear picture of the moral situation other than, for many of us, it just seemed right to put an end to Saddam's regime. And again, at CIA, we worked very hard and diligently to provide the best analysis we could to enable our government and our military to do this. Okay. Despite all this, it was only later that we began to understand that perhaps intelligence had not played its full role. In its ideal conception, intelligence, or more accurately, strategic intelligence, is the fusion of information from a variety of clandestine and open sources, and its analysis is packaged to help our leaders form policy regarding war and peace. As Sherman Kent explained during the CIA's early years, it is or should be the, quote, knowledge required for decision and action. Its job is to see that the doers are well informed. Its job is to stand behind them with the book open to the right page. But it seems to me that in the run-up to Operation Iraqi Freedom, as much as we tried to keep the policymakers well informed, some were not interested in looking at the right page. This was especially true if that page held information that differed from their preferred view. In the time I have, I cannot, nor do I have a desire to go over the various fights between the intelligence community and other parts of the government over the analysis of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, Iraq al-Qaeda links, the reliability of reporting from Iraqi expatriates affiliated with Ahmed Chalabi, and other issues where, quote, unhelpful, unquote, analysis was ignored or undermined. I personally believe there was culpability on all sides for what some would characterize as the misuse of intelligence analysis, as well as for the analytic flaws by the intelligence community that led to mistaken assessments on the status of Iraq's WMD programs and other matters. For the discussion at hand on preventive war, however, I think it's worth saying that in retrospect, it is clear that intelligence was not used to make the most important national security decisions regarding war, and instead was relegated primarily for use supporting the public case for military force. I say this in large part because the President's key advisors on issues of war and peace have stated publicly that they were never asked if they thought it was a good idea to go to war. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld in his recent memoir wrote that he was never asked, and because none of the principals ever stated opposition, assumed that all agreed. CI Director Tenet also says that he was never asked, and according to Bob Woodward, he allegedly told an aide that he thought going to war was wrong. Neither man, nor anyone else apparently, thought to offer their opinions to the Commander-in-Chief. And frankly, that thought still amazes me. I can only imagine what the conversation might have been had the principal leaders of the United States, perhaps including senior leaders from Capitol Hill, had gone over what American strategic intelligence had to say about any of the applicable just war or legalist paradigm criteria, especially with regard to preventive war. At a minimum, I think there would have been much more discussion about the actual risks Saddam's Iraq posed to its neighbors, U.S. allies, and the United States. And again, as sort of has been discussed previously, there's that issue of capabilities versus intentions, which is always the hard part of the work we do at the intelligence community. We're actually pretty good on a lot of the capability stuff. It's the intentions that get you, and that's where the greatest uncertainty is. With such deliberations, there possibly would have been a move away from the technical discussions about what weapons Saddam might have to a more thorough consideration of the Iraqis' intentions and the ability to use them. While there was a plausible case, as Robert Jervis has written, to be made about active and growing WMD programs in Iraq, there would have been much more difficulty, I believe, in making anything more than a highly speculative case for Saddam being able to sustain any type of serious threat to a neighbor's territorial integrity or sovereignty. Another one of the ironies of the period was pointed out by an in-house CIA study led by former Deputy Director Richard Kerr. He noted in a study that although the administration regularly ignored what he called human factor analyses that were closer to the mark regarding Iraqi intentions and likely post-war developments, it was the more technical analysis of products, such as the flawed Iraq WMD estimate, that was more readily embraced. I don't presume to know how such dedicated discussions might have turned out, but I think that in examining more closely the assessments relevant to the risk and uncertainty surrounding the issue, they might have created a case for better war planning and for preparations for some of the post-war challenges we faced. Actually, although it may appear odd to some, CIA has some practice with this approach. Former DCI William Colby in 1989 wrote that the standards for selecting covert actions that are just could be developed by analogy with just war doctrines. And since the early 1990s, the CIA Covert Action Review Group has explored questions regarding proposed covert actions that are consistent with just war theory. Former Director Judge William Webster noted in 1991 that the review group explored whether a proposed covert action was consistent with our laws and American values and made sense to the American people. As one CIA officer has written, these standards were easily reformulated to coincide with just war criteria. Indeed, based on my experience overseeing covert action programs while serving on the National Security Council, it appears that the decision to go to war received much less consideration and review than what was normally applied to the preparation and signing of a presidential finding necessary to conduct a covert action program. And again, I'm distinguishing between the decision to take the action versus all the work that went into deciding how to take the action. I'll finish with one last thought. Secretary of Defense Gates, in a speech at West Point in April of 2008, reminded the cadets that war is, by its nature, unpredictable and uncontrollable. He insisted, and I agree, that the Bush doctrine of preemption is legitimate. But, former CIA analyst that he is, Secretary Gates wondered out loud, quote, how high must the threshold of confidence in our intelligence have to be to justify at home and abroad a preemptive or preemptive war? Secretary Gates did not answer his question, and I think that's because the question isn't answerable. As I said at the beginning, the context matters. The answer will need to be developed on a case-by-case basis. To ensure that such deliberations in the future are done well and adequately justify the preventive or preemptive use of force, however, I can only hope that future U.S. political and military leaders maintain a strong policymaker-intelligence relationship. This relationship needs to be honest and needs to be based on a goodwill that tolerates disagreements and holds to recognized standards of analytic discipline and critical thinking. For all our flaws, I've been impressed during my years at CIA and as a member of the larger intelligence community by the seriousness with which analysts hold to their professional values, particularly regarding analytic objectivity and integrity. They take their oath seriously, and while some fail to always uphold the standard, the vast majority strives mightily to do their job well and to provide the best and most objective analysis possible. In short, to meet increased thresholds of confidence, this high level of objectivity is what we have to continue to seek. And while analysts understand that policymakers have a different role, all have to adhere to standards in assessing information. Ideology and dogma have to be put aside for the national interest. And in terms of moral issues, the foundation of determining whether the criteria for preventive war have been met must include a common understanding of the moral requirement for honesty, particularly in analyzing and interpreting vague, incomplete, and uncertain intelligence information. The stakes for our country and for the fate of beneficial international rule of law are much too high to do otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Our third speaker and discussant for the day is Joe Wood. Joe is a member of the Marshall Fund, where he's been since 2008 as a senior resident fellow. Prior to that, he served as a Deputy Assistant to Vice President for National Security Affairs beginning in 2005, responsible for United States policy focused on Europe, Eurasia, and Africa. He is retired Air Force Colonel with assignments including operational and command of fighter wings in Korea and Europe, faculty member at the United States Air Force Academy, as well as senior position in the Office of the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, as well as the Joint Staff, U.S. Mission to the Conventional Forces in Europe negotiations in Vienna, Office of Secretary of Defense, as well as SHAPE headquarters in Mons, Belgium. Though again, the most important thing you know about Joe is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, proving that we have accomplished jointness. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and to the first two presenters. It's an honor to be here. It's a beautiful place. Naval Academy is a fantastic venue for talking about and thinking about these kinds of things. I have to say, I walked around a little bit earlier today, and we've got West Point at the Air Force Academy. We have Annapolis. They're widely different geographic situations, but they all have a certain common feeling to them. And I tell you, there's 30-year-old instincts that can't be repressed. I was walking around, seeing the place, and I was suddenly seized with horror that my shoes are not polished. I haven't worried about that in a long, long time, but it comes right back. I negotiated for myself the role of respondent today. I did that for a couple of reasons. One is I have no large published body of work on this issue or these sets of issues, so I'd rather listen to people who have thought very carefully about them. I hope I've thought carefully about them, but not maybe in the professional and rigorous way that many of you have and you've been charged to do. So I got myself the job of respondent, which also suits me because I'm basically a lazy person, and being respondent is absolutely the heart of sloth. You have no work to do other than listen to the other folks and react to them. I want to go through both the presentations, or at least a few key points that we just heard, and raise some questions and some points, and then maybe offer a few conclusions of my own. I had a different perspective than Steve's in 2002, 2003. I was still on active duty in the Air Force, and I was working on European issues almost exclusively. But at that time frame, everything we did with Europe had to do with Iraq or Afghanistan. And so I had some interest and involvement in the decisions that were made. And then I went back in 2005, 2008, when the disaster in Iraq at that point was playing out before it turned back up after the surge. So I have a little different perspective than Steve had from the analytical world. And again, a non-academic perspective as well. More of a policy practitioner perspective that I'll try to give you in reaction to the thoughts that we've heard so far. Dr. Rodin talks about the strong moral reasons and presumption, I guess, against prevention, and he begins with what I think is the absolute foundational point, which is that in all of these discussions, I believe the unit of analysis, both for the moral considerations and for the consequence or utilitarian considerations, should be the individual human person. I think the state is secondary to that, and that the morality that we derive about just war and about decision-making to engage in military action has to begin with considerations of what is right, just for the individual person, and secondarily, and by derivation, what is right for the state to accomplish. He talks about, Dr. Rodin talked about war sometimes justified on utilitarian grounds and yet opposed on consequentialist grounds. I want to come back to that because I think it's a very useful distinction, but it also points the other way, I think. And he argues that you can only attack others if, again, please correct me, by the way, don't hesitate if I'm misstating what you stated. You can only attack others if they are guilty or liable as individuals of engaging in either the conspiracy that he developed or an actual military act that is somehow otherwise would justify military response. It seems to me that operationally, when you're looking at this from a policy perspective and a decision of whether to actually take military action, that is fundamentally a question of discrimination between non-combatants and combatants. And it is thus freighted with all the same difficult questions that you face on whether or not a target is legitimate when you're talking about just in bellow just war theory, as well as the larger considerations of whether or not the means you use, means of warfare, military means, are proportional to the objective that you're trying to achieve. I suspect that after it all settles out, that prevention and preemption, work this the other way, a direct response to clear-cut military aggression, and preemption, which is somehow nearer in time or sequence to an actual attack, and prevention, which is farther away from the actual attack. Those may require, in that order, higher and higher needs for discrimination, because there may be a moral, the less that a state has engaged in warfare, the larger may be its population that is in fact innocent, in a sense that it would be discriminated out of violence if you can possibly do that. It also raises an interesting point that I've thought about of what level of cooperation with a government or a regime is sufficient to make one a combatant, which I think in this case is equivalent of saying guilty for your purposes. It's the combatant would be someone who is liable to military response, if I'm using it correctly.
Right. Just very briefly, I don't think you need to be guilty, but I think that
Okay.
in order to be liable, that you have to have done something wrongful. You have to be responsible for having done something wrong, which
But-
is a slightly different question from being guilty.
Yeah. Just to try to put it in the sort of the traditional just war context, if we factor out guilt, then we can consider whether or not, what degree you're participating in the activity that would justify a military response and thus make you liable to a just military response. That's an interesting point, because if you think about the case of Israel, for example, well, any country in modern warfare, in World War II, think about the case of Germany, an Allied bombing of Germany or Japan. At what point did someone become sufficiently complicit in the goals of the Japanese Empire or the Nazi regime in order to justify a military attack in this regard, in order to be liable? Is a person working in a munitions factory liable? In the more modern context, more recent context, is a family that, for whatever reason, provides assistance, lodging to a terrorist sufficiently liable by your standards in order to justify a military response? If there's a terrorist leader living in a home in a village in Afghanistan or in Gaza, wherever it happens to be, is the family, including the children, whose parents have made the decision to lodge that terrorist, liable? I don't know. These are difficult questions. They're quite difficult to resolve, but I think you've done a good job of raising those questions. I think you go on, if I understand it, to talk about the doctrine of preventive war. You talked about the national security strategy, the intent to injure, and the active preparation, and the national security strategy could in fact amount to those kinds of conspiracies. I will say that I think those kinds of doctrines, as espoused by at least the Bush administration and by previous American administrations, presume a just purpose or a just cause, that the act of preempting or the act of prevention would take place where just war criteria have generally been met. I think the criticism of that kind of preparation as a conspiracy would be that it applies to any form of military preparation, because until the military is actually used, you can't know if that use is going to be just. You often can't know it even when it is used, but you really cannot, until you come down to specific cases, understand whether the means are proportional, the purpose is correct, it's the last available result, or all the other criteria of just war. And I think that intention, by the way, is critical to just war. Let me talk just a little bit briefly about Steve's comments. I will tell you that, just as a matter of fact, just war considerations did enter into President Bush's consideration. They were discussed at cabinet level. I'm sorry Secretary Rumsfeld doesn't remember, but they were discussed at cabinet level. They were discussed at staff levels of the White House. The National Security Council staff actually went out and researched considerably into just war and tried its best, I believe, to apply it to what was going on in Iraq in 2002 and 2003. The reason I think they did that, by the way, is that John Paul II indicated considerable concern and opposition to the war in Iraq based on the lack of imminence of threat. It's precisely the kinds of considerations that you were trying to work on at CIA. And I believe President Bush was quite receptive to those for the same reasons that he was receptive to essentially natural law arguments about the issue of stem cell research. He thought about those kinds of issues. He found people who were interested in those kinds of issues to be basically in accord with his instincts, even though he himself, I'm sure, had no formal study in natural law. And so I believe those considerations did come into play. It is correct, I believe, that by summer of 2002, President Bush and Prime Minister Blair had decided that Saddam Hussein was going to go on their watch. I don't think it's correct to say that by summer of 2002, we were going to war. Now, I absolutely believe that there had been another way to get rid of Saddam Hussein and change the regime. Both would have been quite happy to do that. It would have been a far greater victory than anything they envisioned as a result of going to war. And that decision was made by the summer of 2002. That had implications, if you were in fact going to do that, for military preparations and intelligence preparations that had to take place. But I think in the President's mind and in Prime Minister Blair's mind, and I think I'm reasonably well informed on this point, the consideration was that Saddam Hussein was going to go. If that required military means, and the likelihood was that it would require military means, then he would go. With regard to the impact of sanctions, I think that's a great point that Steve raises, and it's one I'll come back to in just a minute, because it raises the question of what is an act of violence. Was the West, under UN sanction throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, engaged in an act of violence against Iraq? Well, it sure looked like it. If you measure it in terms of the consequences and the outcomes for the Iraqi people, it looked very much like that was an act of violence. And I think that raises the point that when you are thinking about just war theory in the modern contemporary time, you are really thinking about a whole range of actions of statecraft that may or may not include soldiers, may or may not include weapons, but which can have quite violent outcomes on individual persons. And the result of that is that these questions become that much more difficult when you have to factor in just war or whatever your criteria are for what is right and wrong, whether this fits a natural order of reality or whether you're violating that with any particular action. We're not making our policymakers' lives any easier with that kind of conversation, but I think unfortunately that is in fact the case. Steve indicates that from his perspective, if I understood you correctly, there was a lack of clarity on the reasons for going to war. Did I get you right?
It's not so much lack of clarity, but in how what we thought we knew and the knowns and unknowns that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld talks about as to what we actually understood about those and how you characterize them.
Yeah, there are two different points that I would make there. The first is that in my own personal opinion, with the benefit of hindsight, sitting here in 2011, in my opinion, the just war failure involved in the decision to go to Iraq did not have to do with a failure to understand whether he really had weapons of mass destruction. We believed it. The French believed it. I can assure you at the most senior levels, the Germans believed it. I do not for a minute believe that President Chirac or Chancellor Schroeder were objecting to Iraq for anything that has any reason that would come up at this conference. It was a completely different set of considerations that led them to object to this action. But I do think that the administration can be faulted and should be faulted for failing to clarify coherently and consistently what the real justification for the war was. There were several different possibilities there. One was introducing a democracy into the Middle East that would have much wider positive ramifications for a region that had a frankly terrible history of defending the human person. Second was the direct threat that was thought to be posed by Saddam Hussein by some. The intelligence did go both ways. I don't think it's correct to say that the intelligence that argued against that was ignored. I think the general gist was there is that evidence, but we have other evidence that suggests that to a reasonable person, the capabilities are what they are, and the intentions, given the opportunity, would be quite bad for us and for the region. So I think that failure to harden and identify a just purpose might be a legitimate indictment of the administration, because the first thing you have to have in just war theory is a just cause, a just purpose. But you also raise the fact that intelligence is not perfect, it's an extremely difficult business, and it really is an important consideration to understand just how hard it is to go to war based on intelligence. If you look at the record of the intelligence community over the last 2 decades, we were wrong about Saddam Hussein not once but twice on weapons of mass destruction. Wrong in 1990-91 because he was much farther along in his weapons of mass destruction than we thought, and we almost sent, we were within a few months of sending American troops, a large number, into a potentially nuclear weapon environment without even knowing about it. The reverse was the problem in 2001, 2002, 2003. We missed Pakistan and India on nuclear explosions. We misjudged Iran in the last decade in every different way that we possibly could. And so there's every reason to believe and to understand that even with the extraordinary capacity of our intelligence community, we're still going to miss it and get it wrong a lot of times. And that is an important caution for policymakers. Let me now come back just to some considerations. How close am I, Jeff, to your harsh?
Good, 5 minutes.
Okay. Just some thoughts of my own about viewing this problem. My take on both preemption and prevention, my personal view, is about what the Clinton administration's view of abortion was. I think it should be safe, legal, and rare. Professor Elshtain used the word rare, and I think that is absolutely correct for the reasons that we've just talked about because of the uncertainty. It should be safe because it should, to a reasonable observer, after a lot of consideration and debate, it should be an action that creates greater safety for individual persons rather than less safety. That's number one. It should be legal because I think it's morally and philosophically defensible and necessary. And we heard from Professor Elshtain this morning a far better presentation than I could give on why that's the case. And I think it should be rare for the reasons that Steve talks about, the uncertainties and the difficulties of knowing what the circumstances are out there when you're dealing with closed regimes who don't want you to know what they're doing and what they can do. Very difficult considerations. I do believe that governments are formed fundamentally to produce positive goods that individual persons themselves cannot produce. Now, we can talk a lot about social contract and those kinds of theories, but fundamentally that is what governments and states try to do. And that the purpose of government is to serve individual persons rather than the reverse. I believe that the character of the government that is taking military action and the character of the government that is being acted upon are in fact important moral factors because they give you a reason to presume one way or the other and raise your threshold or, if necessary, lower your threshold about military action. I believe that authoritarian and totalitarian regimes are far more likely to do the various kinds of things that produce a just war response, justly produce a just war response, than our democracies. If we saw tomorrow, well, we'll use an extremely unlikely case now, Japan producing nuclear weapons because it had decided that the American nuclear guarantee is insufficient and that they believe that for their security in the region, nuclear weapons are important to them, I don't think you could create a very good case for preventive action there. Iran is almost exactly the opposite case. I think you can make a very good case there. I think that Israel's destruction of the facility in Syria in 2008, which they had apparently, according to press reports, received help from North Korea on, and its destruction of the Osiris reactor in Iraq were both thoroughly just preventive actions that were safe, legal, and rare. But again, I think the character of the government helps us identify what is legitimate and illegitimate, what is just and unjust. I do believe that one good or responsibility of government is the defense of the people it serves, and thus the need for preemption in some cases that I've already talked about. And I think that the objections to preemption and prevention are ultimately consequentialist. We talked about that a little bit now. Sometimes I think people try to argue that any kind of military action in the absence of a direct military provocation is an intrinsic evil. And I don't think that's the case, and I think everyone on the panel this morning, I gather we are all agreed that you have to look at consequences at some level. I may be wrong, but it sounds like that's the direction you're driving. Once you cross the line into acknowledging that consequences have an effect on whether an action is just or not, then you're in the murky world of real policy and real politics, where motives differ, where the level of confidence and the ability to predict unintended consequences will differ from case to case. And I would say finally that I'm certainly not in favor of referenda for deciding every policy issue. I don't think direct democracy is the best form of government or the wisest form of government. But I do think that there is a factor of common sense, and that over the course of time, free people, given their freedom, will make good decisions. Maybe not at every instant, maybe not every decision, but over the course of time. And I am not aware of any free society which has chosen to permanently and in all cases proscribe preemption or prevention. And I don't think any free people would elect a government that would, in any and all cases, prescribe that. And I give some weight to that, again, with some careful cautions about the fact that people can make bad decisions and do make bad decisions. Over the course of time, I think there's a certain wisdom there that we need to acknowledge. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, and I want to thank the panel for staying spot on time. Excellent work. I think before we go to question and answers, perhaps we should offer David and Steve the opportunity, if they want to make any quick comments on the discussant's remarks. Anything you want to?
Sure. I'll
For a
say
moment.
few. Thank you very much for those very thoughtful and probing comments. I think I agree with really a lot of what you said. Just maybe a couple of thoughts. You said you kind of posed or recast some of the things that I was saying in terms of the question of discrimination. And I think there's one sense in which you were right to do that, maybe another sense in which that was perhaps a little bit mischaracterizing the way that I was putting the argument, in the sense that traditionally, of course, the way that we've thought about discrimination is the requirement to only use directly targeted force against combatants, never against non-combatants. And that those set of obligations were seen to be equally distributed to all combatants on all sides of every conflict. All right? So it didn't matter whether you were fighting a just war of self-defense or an unjust war of aggression. You equally had the obligation not to target non-combatants. You equally had the permission to target combatants. Now, the way that I've been thinking about this is not that way. So the way I've been thinking about it is to say that you can violate somebody's rights by killing them, even if they are a combatant. So I think that if somebody, if a state engages in a military action that is unjustified, it's an act of aggression, then even if they only kill soldiers on the other side, all of those deaths are unjust, and they're violations of rights. And I think the sense in which you're right to say, maybe the right way to think about prevention is that you narrow the field of discrimination. I think that probably coheres with the comments that I made at the end, which was to say that, well, if we're thinking about, the concept of conspiracy, and we're drawing a distinction between, appropriate military planning and wrongful conspiracy on the other hand, I do think that's a coherent distinction to draw. But it seems to me that those cases of wrongful conspiracy will often be very, very localized by normally a small cabal of people at the very, very top of the military and political hierarchy. So if what you're saying is, well, in cases like that, those people might be liable to be attacked, so that we kind of narrow very radically the field of discrimination, then I think that that's probably right.
I mean, the example there would be Iran.
Right.
If you were to attack Iran at this point, based on the potential threat, I presume that you would at least be justified in attacking the nuclear facilities directly and those who are engaged in the production of nuclear weapons.
Well, like you say, a lot of it depends on the context and the.
Go ahead.
But
Go ahead.
Yeah, but the form of the justification would have to take exactly that form. That those individual people were engaged in an action that was demonstrably wrong, that they were responsible for it in meaningful ways. Again, it's not the same thing as saying that they're guilty for doing that, but there was a degree of responsibility and direct participation in that. I think what wouldn't be correct is to say that Iran would be liable to a full-scale regime-changing invasion that would.
I don't want to take away time for questions, but the question that immediately pops up, though, is can you ever then respond militarily against a military that is conscript-based?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think, again, the way that I think about conscripts is that there are a lot of conditions which might lead us to say that there's not, they're not guilty for doing what they're doing, but still, they're there within the chain of command. They are engaging as free agents in military activity. They're firing weapons. Those are things that those are doing.
Depends on. If you're a conscript, in some senses, you have the enemy's guns to face and your own behind you, and so
This happens in Iraq.
Kind of different.
Yep.
Sort of tools.
It's different. Yeah.
Pete, do you have any quick comments?
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick, because I also don't want to cut into question and answers, but at the risk of sounding defensive, which I don't want to, I do agree with your point about evidence, I was probably wrong to characterize it as ignored, and that, as analysts, we recognize policymakers, one, incredibly smart people, very capable. They have lots of access to information that the analysts sometimes don't have. They have lots of experiences that, make their considered judgments, I'd say trump an analyst in a lot of cases, if not most. That said, I do think there was an issue in the run-up to the Iraq war, why it was a sensitive issue or that sometimes felt that you were ignored, is that when you have access to other evidence or other evidence that you consider, as I tried to indicate in my last remarks, there still needs to be sort of an empirical standard that is applied to that. In a lot of cases, and some of it's been documented, that the same sort of standards that the intelligence community tries to use in weighing and judging information and sources of information weren't applied to some of the information that was later cited as support for some of the positions that the administration took. And also, and again, at the risk of sounding defensive, when people talk about the record of the intelligence community at prediction or assessment, a more formal term, I always say, yeah, compared to who or whom? Yes, predicting the future is a hazardous task. You don't get a lot of things right. That's generally the record of it, but compared to whom? Almost, you look at the financial press prior to 2008, did they get everything right? Do you look at sports writers who have access to all the information about all the teams? Do they get it right when they look at who's going to win? And even on policymakers, over the years, even going back to the Team A, Team B panel of the 1970s, looking at the state of the Soviet Union, the Soviet threat. The intelligence community, in historical respect, usually comes out better than the people who were coming in and criticizing the intelligence community on where they were. And while we may not have gotten it right in some cases, in a lot of times we're much closer to ground truth than other folks. So fair point on your part, but I did want to say we recognize the differences and accept them. And just, again, been characterized by one pundit in the Washington Times as vulgar empiricist, and we actually kind of embrace that. We don't mind being a vulgar empiricist. We just kind of wish everyone else would be that way as well.
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to take the criteria or the prerogative, I guess I should say, of the chair to ask the first question to the panel. And I want to bring it back to, I think we're already introduced the conference, and that is, how do we translate many of these ideas now into policy? And I want to push the panel a bit on that. I guess the question I want to ask the panel is, does this discussion on preventive and preemptive war help us right now, as we're really dealing with a thorny problem here of the responsibility to protect with respect, for example, to Libya. And I know there's a panel tomorrow George Lucas is going to chair, but our distinguished keynoter touched on this, so I'd like to get the panel's thought. Does this discussion of preventive and preemptive war, the criteria one applies, is that useful at all in thinking about the knotty question that policymakers are scrambling about at the moment? It would seem, in a way, one could say preventive war is preventing a threat to us. As our keynoter pointed out, every states have a legal responsibility to protect their populations. In the case of responsibility to protect, as we see in Libya, it's similar in a way. We're preventing a threat, but it's to somebody else. We don't perhaps have the same legal responsibility, but it's a threat to someone else. But there's that challenge for us, and I think for policymakers, to explain that, to galvanize international support and galvanize public support. And Joe certainly touched on that in his discussant remarks. But there's a clear difference. Preventive war obviously ends in a somewhat clean fashion, one could argue, perhaps. Saddam was taken out. The Taliban were taken out. There is a sort of finality. We may not have done it that well, and it was Secretary Rumsfeld was a little untidy there afterwards, but there was that ending of the threat, at least to us. Responsibility to protect leaves us in perhaps a bit more of a murky position in that it doesn't have that clear-cut finality. Right now, one could argue you have this conundrum where under the criteria of the responsibility, one should bomb Gaddafi's forces who are threatening civilians in Benghazi, and then if the rebels are able to threaten the Gaddafi-loyal city of Sirte, you should start bombing the rebels, which is going to be a pretty difficult thing to explain internationally, let alone explain to the American people whose side are you actually on here. Also, questions of precedent, I think, need to be addressed. Now, how do you deal with that? I mean, certainly we move more quickly in this regard than we ever did in Bosnia or in Kosovo, or never did, certainly in Rwanda. But where does that leave us now if we're on a quick change in thinking about this, about Syria or Bahrain or Yemen? I mean, if Mr. Assad should start wiping out a city, as his father did, does that then, because of a precedent we have established now, move us quickly in that direction? And finally, pick up on this question that Joe threw out at the end on liability. I mean, how does that question of liability, which David discussed very interesting, I thought, apply in this regard? Is it illegal for us, for example, to take out, deliver a tomahawk to some poor Libyan air defense guy who was quietly doing his job manning an aging Soviet air defense weapon as the preliminary part of the attack? He wasn't threatening any civilians in Benghazi. Or the guy who simply is driving a truck delivering sea rations to the people who are moving on Benghazi? Or do we need to be more discriminatory in these type of missions based on what we've learned in our thinking about preventive and preemptive war? I hope that's enough of a question.
Maybe I can just have a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that I would see what's going on in Libya as necessarily involving issues of preemption and prevention in the way that we've been discussing them here, in the sense that what we had was a humanitarian crisis that had been caused by the decision of the Gaddafi regime to use force against his own people that was really already in full swing. People had been shot on the streets, troops were moving towards Benghazi. Very clear indications that he was going to slaughter very large numbers of people in Benghazi. So I would see that as a case of, even beyond imminent threat. This was actually threat that was in full swing. But in terms of your kind of broader questions, all of which are very, very important and very interesting. But my own view on the intervention is that is that we shouldn't be taking one side or the other. My view is that the UN Security Council actually got the mandate absolutely right when it said that there was a cause for using all necessary means to protect civilians. And it seems to me that is exactly the way that we should be crafting the mandate of the operation here. The force should be used to open up a space for an indigenous peaceful politics within Libya. And we ought to make it very clear that we will strike against government troops that attack civilians, and we will also strike against rebel troops that attack civilians. It becomes a little bit more complicated, obviously, when you phrase it in terms of attacks on civilian areas rather than attacks on civilians themselves. But the basic principle, to my mind, should exactly be that one, that we are there to open up and protect that space for peaceful politics, and that the people that we can use force against are any military forces on either side who are threatening or attacking civilians.
Steve?
A little difficult area for me, so I'll try and be careful, but just from what I read in the newspaper, I think the intelligence challenges is that clearly Libya has not been outside of proliferation and terrorism issues of that much concern to the United States. So I suspect there's not been a tremendous effort to collect on it over the years, and that, as you can read from the paper, there's a lot we don't know about what's going on and who's involved. From the intelligence perspective, meeting that high threshold of knowledge is going to be very, very hard, and in some respects might be more dependent on how capable the analysts are at going back and mining libraries for what we know about the tribal confederations and Tripolitania and other parts of Libya, and trying to figure out who's who as best we can, and to get a sense of it. And again, this was humanitarian intervention, at least the way I was reading it, which again is an issue that the intelligence community kind of struggles with, because when you start talking about the question of national interest and again trying to get a good take on what is the threat and really the net assessment that has to be done. And you got to remember, the intelligence community, we assess the bad guys or the foreign folks. When the United States starts to get involved, it actually becomes more complicated. I started my career working the Iran-Iraq War, and at the time it was just Iran and Iraq, and it was probably the best time of my life as an analyst because I was looking at two foreign countries fighting each other. And the moment we started Operation Earnest Will, where the U.S. Navy came in and started escorting tankers, work just got so much more difficult because we were involved, and you started to get involved in where you couldn't just say things about the Iranian Navy or the Iraqi Air Force without having someone at the Pentagon coming and, you know, claiming you're starting to get into net assessment because you're making claims about how capable these systems are. And since we don't know U.S. systems at CIA, how can we make claims about these foreign systems? So you know, once the U.S. gets involved, it becomes much more difficult for us in that regard.
Okay. Joe, do you have any comments?
Yeah, David's note about opening space for political freedom, is that
Yep.
the correct phrase? No,
Or a political process. I mean, just
Yeah.
some kind of peaceful indigenous process.
you know, I didn't know you were such a neocon. I didn't.
Well, maybe if I could do
All right, now, all right. As a chairman, okay.
I think it's a valid purpose for political activity and for the United States to engage in the effort of, and our allies to engage in the effort to open political space for, I would say, for human freedom, for freedom of individual persons. I think in the case of Libya, there is a case to be made that it is a just action. I think there's a case to be made that it's not a just action. It hinges on the motives of the leaders who are involved and what their purposes are. I think those are widely varying. I think President Sarkozy has one view of what we're doing in Libya. President Obama has a very different view of what we're doing in Libya, and people are coalescing around those. I do think it raises a couple of, the situation raises a couple of questions. One is, what that really seems to me to call for is regime change. If that's going to be the justification, I should say, because I don't think you're going to get political space in Libya under the Gaddafi regime. Now, you may constrain the areas in which the Gaddafi regime exercises sovereignty and create space outside of those, but that's a form of regime change. You're just changing the space in which he's allowed to operate. So I think at the end of the day, if you're going to make that kind of an argument, then what you're arguing for is regime change, and I think we have to think about that pretty carefully. What I am struck by in the case of what we're dealing with now and what the White House, I think, is struggling to deal with, what the UK, Prime Minister Cameron, Sarkozy are all struggling to deal with, is that we face in the Middle East, in the Arab world, a situation which is comparable, I think, to 1989 in Europe. The strategic ramifications and the potential for a real change in how a lot of individual human persons live is just enormous. And the potential outcome there, in other words, the potential gain is so large that the means we are potentially justified in employing seem to me quite large. The arguments against that are all prudential in the contemporary sense. We don't know what the consequences will be in any individual country. I may have missed the memo, but I still don't know really who the Libyan rebels are. There's some former Al-Qaeda, there are some people who genuinely believe in a freer form of government, but it's a mix that I don't fully understand at all. I don't think we know what would replace the Gaddafi regime. Were we to change it, the changing would be fine. What would replace it would be the difficult problem. And that's true across the region as well. And so I think we just got a lot of thinking to do, and I'm not sure we have, well,
Let's do some of that thinking right now. And in terms of the, start with the gentleman here, and then we'll go to this gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Great panel. My name is Hendrik Susa. I'm the editor of Journal of Military Ethics. I'll take the opportunity on behalf of Martin Cook and myself to say Jamie is right over there in terms of some leaflets there and some copies you can leave through if you want to. And obviously a lot of people here who are not already familiar with the journal would be very welcome to submit or read. Now, David, quick question from a philosopher to a philosopher. I think you're self-defeating sort of tag when it comes to the doctrine of prevention, namely that if you show manifest intent and preparation, you are already yourself violating what you say is wrong. And you are saying the only way out of that is a difference between contingency and non-contingency. If you are doing it because the other party is doing it first, that could be the way out of it. Now, the more commonsensical way out of that would be to say that there's a difference between the sorts of intentions and the sorts of causes, just cause and right intention in the just war language, in the sense that the person or party preparing to use force preventively because they want to stop genocide would be different from the party that wants to use force preventively or before they have been attacked in order to spread weapons of mass destruction, for instance. Why would you want to bracket that moral part of it? Is it because the intention that any party will believe that it does what is right is because it somehow messes up the philosophical argument, because commonsensically it would seem that that would be the crucial difference between right and wrong use of preventive force, what your actual intention is, and I guess you could say what just calls for.
Sir.
No, great. So, I mean, obviously, that's going to be incredibly relevant, right? So, if the intention and the preparation is directed towards something like genocide, that's going to be critically different to something like the Bush Doctrine, which is a preparation for engaging in a military intervention in another state. That's clearly right. But I guess the cases that I'm interested in, the cases that that seem to be most relevant, are exactly cases where it looks like there's a kind of a rough symmetry in terms of the objective that's being planned on both sides, right? So we have this kind of this conditional intent to engage in preemptive action, potentially against a state like Iran. Iran isn't planning to engage in a genocidal attack against the United States. Let's put some questions of Israel aside for just a minute. But, argue that does engage that. But I mean, a lot of Iran's desire to get nuclear weapons, a lot of their action is presumably very defensive in its own right. So they're seeking to act in ways or put in place conditions for their own security, which is, I take it, not a fundamentally different form of moral goal to the kind of security-based goals that we have.
Gentleman over here in the red tie.
Yeah, David, the same variation on the same theme. Supporting comment that Mr. Wood made at the end of this response, and this is on the question of contingent versus non-contingent, which I think, as you can see, dissolves the paradox. That dissolves it. If you can distinguish between these two forms, that dissolves the paradox. And your objection to the dissolution, the paradox is that there are epistemic problems with it, but I think here, sometimes philosophers, and I'm like you, you're a genuine philosopher, I'm a self-appointed. We have sometimes are guilty of decontextual, of actually, I would put differently, of ignoring or not paying attention to social theory. So there is a theory out there that actually may help normal, impartial observers to actually determine intent. Again, it's a theme, I'm reinforcing a theme that Mr. Wood, an issue that the point that Mr. Wood made. For example, democratic peace theory predicts that rights, respect, and democracies will use force, prepare for force continuity. And it also predicts that the opposite of authoritarian regimes or non-liberal or non-democratic, whatever you call it, non-price respecting, will very often prepare for war non-continuity, offensive, right? So therefore, there you have a theory. Now, you might think that democratic peace theory is not reliable theory, but if it is, I mean, it might be something, and the literature is pretty extensive to give all kinds of reasons for these predictions, right?
Could you bring it to a question?
I'm sorry?
Could you bring it to a question, sir?
Yeah, the question, I already asked the question. The question is, what do you make of social theory that would actually help you predict the intentions?
Right. So, I mean, democratic peace theory seems to work to the extent that democracies don't tend to go to war with each other, but they are incredibly bellicose when it comes to non-democracies. So if you look at the table of states that have gone to war most in the 20th century, the two states at the top of that table by an enormous margin are the United States and the United Kingdom, and France is very close up there as well. So I think that there are a lot of benefits that democracies have over non-democracies, including normative and epistemological benefits. But I think it's very difficult to read off from that that they will be better in terms of the way that they think about the use of force against, particularly against non-democracies. I mean, just to come to your specific question, I think that the distinction between contingent and non-contingent does solve it, probably at a conceptual level. My worries are, at the practical level in terms of applying that in the rule. I think it also, in most cases, will only solve it in terms of establishing liability for a very, very narrow class of objects of force, those that are at the very, very high end of the political and military echelon. I think that for the majority of ordinary soldiers, who are the people who are going to bear the brunt of the action, it's quite hard to make that solution work for them, at least.
We'll go to Dr. Elstein, our distinguished keynote speaker.
This takes things another direction.
That's
so I
fine.
don't know. Is that okay? One of the concerns that I have listening to this has to do with how the notion of innocence is being used, whether it applies to non-combatants or to combatants. And it's my general understanding that when we speak of the innocent in the context of just war, that we're not referring to some putative moral innocence in any absolute sense, but to the fact that there are some people who are they're helpless, they're vulnerable, they have no capacity to defend themselves. And that's why we include all non-combatants in the category of innocent. So that, for example, if someone looking back at the history of World War II makes an argument against the bombing of German cities, the argument would be, I'm opposed to targeting civilians, period. And you don't say, well, unfortunately, when we did that, we killed X number of people who actually opposed the Hitler regime. So what happens when you start to weaken that notion of innocence and start to think more in the language of, who does or doesn't support a certain action? And this presumably could be extended to combatants as well, because we know that there are some combatants in given situations who may be involved in a military action that they actually disagree with. But as combatants, they're part of the chain of command and they're obliged to follow orders. So that's sort of one cluster of concerns. The other, extending from that or being drawn out from that, has to do with imagining, let's say, that you have a situation where one side in a particular conflict claims justice. They have the just cause. The other side has no just cause. Therefore, the combatants on the other side are not deserving of the same sorts of moral rights of combatants historically, so to speak, because they're fighting for a completely unjust cause. Are you not concerned about what that means as far as the brutality of the battlefield, the treatment of prisoners, and all the rest? Well, there's more, but let me just stop right there.
Okay. Steve? Steve as well as David? Steve, you have? David, I'll turn it over to you.
It's really
Okay.
Sure. So these are all, incredibly important and profound questions. So just really, really briefly, it seems to me that if we take the idea of rights seriously, then a necessary condition for being liable to be targeted is that you have some kind of at least minimal responsibility for an unjust, very significant unjust threat on someone else. I don't think that means you need to be guilty, because you can imagine situations like, if somebody was attacking you because the mafia had captured your family, their family, and were threatening them, you would have an excuse in law under duress. So you wouldn't be held criminally responsible for the attack, but nonetheless it seems that you're entitled to kill that person to defend yourself, because he is responsible for the unjust threat, at least minimally responsible for the unjust threat that he's posing towards you. So it seems to me that having that kind of minimal responsibility for an unjust threat is an absolutely baseline necessary condition for being liable to the use of force. And that's why I think that if it's really true that you are a combatant fighting a proper and appropriate defensive war within all of the boundaries of jus in bello, it seems to me I can't understand how that person can be a proper target for attack. They're an ordinary rights-bearing person. Now, does that mean that having that kind of minimal responsibility for imposing an unjust threat on someone else is a sufficient condition for being targeted? Here I'm much less clear. Some people have argued that. Some of Jeff McMahon's arguments have suggested conclusions in that direction. I'm not so sure. It seems to me that there are cases where we might want to say that although it's a necessary condition to have that kind of responsibility, it's not sufficient, and that it only becomes sufficient in the context of some kind of present aggression. So to take the mafia example a little bit further, let's say that the mafia people who'd done this induction and were forcing you to threaten me were also sustained by certain people in their community, by their family. Does that mean that you could kill the family and the community members just because they sustain and give succor to those mafia bosses? Probably not. right? Although in some sense they're responsible for the action of the mafia bosses, they're not the ones that are kind of posing that threat to you. I think that matters, and I think that that can make a difference to the case that you gave of the people who give, who give housing to terrorists. It seems to me there's a really, really important difference between those. So my view on this is that responsibility for unjust aggression is a necessary condition, but it's not always a sufficient condition. And it seems to me that there's a very, very strong presumption against targeting people that, as you say, are defenseless, even if they may have contributed, and maybe even contributed culpably, to the wrongful aggression of others. I think there are lots and lots of very difficult issues kind of buried within that, but just really briefly, that's my view.
Jeff, can I just jump in?
I'm gonna
Jeff?
because we're running out of time, so I got 3 people left who I'd like to ask questions, so I had to ask those 3 to please ask very succinct questions, and then we'll come back for a quick rejoinder and move on. So these 2 gentlemen here, and then Reed, whichever one of you 2 would like to go first. Very succinct, please.
Thanks very much. As I understand the talks on the panel and Dean's talk, there's material conditions for their beating, preventive attacks, and there's liability conditions. If we think about Iran, we want to think about the costs, we want to think about the threat, we want to think about the liability. But what if the costs are low? Does it really bother us about liability, about violating sovereignty? I'm thinking here the fact that there already has been a preventive attack in Iran, a preventive cyber attack. And the question is it the same moral framework? We
Good
want
question.
a different moral framework for thinking about cyber attacks. Or in the words that Joe used, if it's safe and it's legal, does it really bother us that it's not rare? Can it be more common?
Okay, sir? Very short.
To come back to the fundamental distinction between preemption and prevention, because I'm still skeptical that we can maintain a kind of clear line between the main target and the target. And I'm thinking particularly of a case in Gentile's lectures on the laws of war in the late 16th century, where he argues that it would be just for a state, a group of states, to attack either Spain or the Ottomans, even if they're not posing an imminent threat, because their goal is clear: to mass power, clear from the facts on the ground. And he says that we have to act while there's time. Now, the overall argument sounds preventive, but he's changing the terms, or he's stretching the category of imminence to mean acting while there's time. I just am puzzled whether we can maintain a clear distinction, and if not, whether we can make as much use of it as we're trying to do.
Reed?
My question sort of mashes together the 2 categories of elective war, making a choice of a war, whether it's preemptive or preventive. I'll just preface by mentioning when I was in Iraq as a field historian, I was interviewing an infantry company commander. He asked me to turn the tape recorder off at one point, and that's when he told me about the 2 dead babies they found in the house that his company had been engaging. They killed them. And I want to suggest that rather than requiring that we only are targeting legitimate combatants who are culpable in some way, that, and this may be a question for the professional military as a group, the CJCS, who hasn't been mentioned in the deliberation so far, we tell people this is what war is going to be like. Innocent people are going to be killed. Maybe more innocent people, completely innocent people, non-combatants, etc., than combatants are killed. So whatever it is that we're justifying or doing this for has to be for such a good reason that we are okay with this happening, probably on a large scale. Someone mentioned the indeterminacy of going to war. My equivalent is what you're sort of doing, you're opening up your neighbor's back door and you're taking an angry, if well-trained Doberman and throwing him into the back door of the house and hoping things will work themselves out. You come back in an hour or 2 and get him, if you can. That's it.
What I would like to do then is start in the reverse order, and Joe, will begin with you, and we'll work our way back up. And you can pick and choose from that menu of questions.
The first thing I wanted to do, David's presentation, I think, has provoked most thought on the panel. It seems to me that in your emphasis on thinking about how people make themselves liable to a military attack that's just, you are emphasizing the rights of those in the attacked country. If you're going to put it in terms of that kind of right, and I'm not sure I would, but if you're arguing on those grounds, I think you also need to consider the rights of those who are in the attacking country in this case. In other words, what are the rights of those who are taking the preventive or preemptive action? Because there's a whole universe of rights that are out there, presumably, you could posit. And those are in other words, it's not a clear-cut case of whether you're violating the rights of those in an attacked country in the case of a preventive or preemptive action. That's one set of rights, but you have a contending set of rights, and contending populations of rights. I also, just to pick up on the notion of time, am struck in all of the distinctions between prevention, preemption, and actual response to an aggression on the emphasis on time, and how time and, in a sense, empirical analysis or empirical awareness becomes the decisive factor for what's just and what's not. It seems to me that if there's a set of outcomes that are just and a set of outcomes that are unjust, and you view time as a whole, they are unjust or just without regard to when they actually occur. And I wonder if in arguing that the sequence of events is what produces the justice, whether it's the attack that occurs, how somebody gives up his rights, that we ignore the actual final purpose that we're trying to achieve to begin with.
Steve.
I guess the only thing I could really address is your question about thresholds for cyber war. And one thing I would say is on my own experience, again, going back to covert action and any type of sort of hopefully unattributable action a country might take against another country, is that my experience has been the thresholds remain very, very high. General Hayden, former director of Central Intelligence, was here at the Academy earlier this semester talking about cyber war. And as he said, we don't have a policy really for how to use this, and it's been handled on kind of a case-by-case basis. That was certainly my experience over the past couple of decades where I've had opportunities to work on covert action. And as I indicated in my presentation, those things get a lot of consideration. The thresholds are very high. There's a lot of discussions. I don't recall ever having philosophers in the mix, but there's always a lot of lawyers. And so you know, I'd say even if it becomes easy, and I've looked at programs where we have technical capabilities. We're Americans. We're good at technical capabilities. We can do a lot of stuff, but at the end of the day, policymakers are very serious in their deliberations about, you know, is it worth it? It's kind of consequentialist view of the thing, but at the end of the day, they really do continue to weigh the costs and benefits, and even if something is quote unquote easy, or you know that there's appearance that maybe the blowback or other cost of the action is going to be low, is that there's still a lot of times looking down the road, are we setting a precedent? Could this come back to bite us sometime further down? Is that policymakers tend to be very, very careful, and so I'd say the threshold probably remain pretty high.
David.
Yeah, well, listen, thanks to everybody for your terrific questions. I can't answer all of them. I just wanted to come back on a couple of points that you really helpfully made. You're obviously right to say that we need to consider all of the rights in play, not only the rights of those in the state that we're thinking about intervening in. And obviously, you know, governments have very strong duties of care over their own citizens. If responsibility is to protect is right, we have responsibilities outside of our own state as well to citizens of other states. And it's incredibly important that we take those seriously. But having said that, you know, everybody seems to agree that there are incredibly important limits on what we can do in fulfilling those responsibilities. So, for example, pretty much everyone agrees that terrorism is off the table, even if that were the most effective or maybe even the only way to protect people within our polity. And my understanding of terrorism is that terrorism is essentially killing people who aren't liable to be killed. I mean, it's essentially exactly the same question that we have in play here. If it's true, as I argued, that in normal cases of preventive action, the people we would have to be killed are not liable to be killed, then what we're essentially debating is whether terrorism can ever be justifiable in order to protect these really important rights and goods. And most people seem to think that, you know, that is a real red line that we ought not to cross. And I want to just come back really quickly on the comment you made earlier about, aren't I just a neocon who ought to be?
I withdraw the comment if you're going.
But there is a really serious point here, and I think it's a really important one to make clear. So people often say, well, the liberal intervention, it's liberal interventionism, it's just Iraq and Afghanistan all over again. It seems to me that there is, I'm not sure that this distinction is in fact being maintained in the way that this operation seems to be evolving over the last week or couple of days. But it seems to me that there is potentially an incredibly important distinction to draw here, which is that Iraq and Afghanistan were fundamentally conceived as regime change operations. So they were political right through to their core. This operation and the way that it was phrased in the UN mandate and the way that potentially it might be able to be conducted can I think, show us a really different way of thinking about these interventions. If the mandate literally is to say we will prevent armed forces from attacking civilians in order to open up the space for them to engage in peaceful protest, peaceful participation in their own politics, then it seems to me that we have a recipe for a much more morally justifiable articulation of what responsibility to protect can be about. Now that, of course, might have, and almost certainly would have, really profound political consequences. Most people think that if the people of Tripoli were free to protest in the streets, Gaddafi probably would go the same way as Mubarak before him. But the difference is that that would be an indigenous process that the Libyan people had brought about through their own action with the protection of the international community, for sure. But that's a very, very different thing from the international community or particular states within it engaging in a direct political regime-changing intervention like we had in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank the panel for what has been, to me, a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank the audience for your participation and attention. I'll be happy now to turn this over to my good friend, Rodin.
Thank you, Jeff. Definitely a thought-provoking panel. The only comment I had is, as Steve had defended, and I think properly, the intelligence community, I'm not sure why he didn't compare it to the weather people, because if you look at that, that'd be another opportunity. I want to thank every person who's on that panel for your service and your contribution to national security and the thought processes towards warfare ethics. So thank you in that regard as well.